My name is Paul Wolver. I'm the owner of Pinellas Power Products. And this is the installation instruction video for my extended runtime fuel kit for generators that run the Sensei 459cc engine. That would include the new DuroMax 9500 and the DuroMax 11000. There are probably others that I'm not aware of yet at this time. This is the installation instruction guide. If you'd like a quick overview of what the kit is and what the kit does, go to my website and watch the product demo video. It's a quick overview of this. If you're watching this video on YouTube, look in the description section below, and it has a link to my website, which will take you to the web page that has all the detailed information about this, as well as all the videos on this product. Otherwise, the first step to installing it is to take the flash drive that's included in the kit and insert it in your computer, and it'll play the videos for you for the product demo and the installation guide and so forth. Let's go ahead and get started with the install. First step is to pull the front cover off. You notice that they've used a tremendous amount of sound dampening or sound deadening foam to reduce the noise on this particular generator. Incidentally, on my generator there was a lot of mismatch in bolts. Like you'll notice that the front cover has two different lengths of bolts. So I think they're getting the bugs worked out of the assembly process. Instead of grabbing the bolts from the appropriate container, they're just grabbing hands full of bolts. There are 3 of these longer bolts. There should only be 2 in the entire generator housing. And real quickly, they would go in these 2 holes, and you'll see exactly why later. So you've got the front cover off. Then we're going to pull this side cover off. First step is to pull the hubcap for the wheel. The wheel itself is held on with a bolt with a 10mm head on it. And it has a flat washer. Now we'll go back to the other bolts, which have the 8mm heads on them. And these are all going to be the shorter bolts. I'm going to try and break this install down into sections like I do with my others, so that the novice or the experienced do-it-yourselfer will both feel comfortable doing this install. Incidentally, all the bolts in this cover should be identical. And we'll leave that up to DuroMax's quality control. It's not really critical that they put the cover on with different lengths of bolts. It's just a quality control issue for them to work through. And obviously, they're going to have their more experienced guys doing the technical jobs as opposed to the cabinet. Okay. This is going to expose the evaporative emissions canister. And we're going to be using an electric fuel pump on this one. It's going to mount on the front. So in order to have enough room for the fuel pump to mount up there, we need to move the evaporative emissions canister backward, and in order to move it backward, we need to move it down just a little bit. So we're going to take these two bolts that hold the evaporative emissions canister out. And you notice that those are the same as the cabinet bolts. Excuse me, those are the same as the shorter cabinet bolts. So then we can take the evaporative emissions canister out through the front here. You'll notice right now this bracket is bolted on with the tabs facing this way, so it moves it forward. We're going to take this bracket off by taking these two screws out, and we're going to turn the bracket completely upside down so that then the canister is moved back approximately 16 millimeters. So this tab goes on like this, and now this bracket, we took it off like this. We're ultimately going to bolt it back on like this so that the tab faces forward. Before we do that, we're going to go ahead and mark the holes that we're going to need to drill on the cabinet here. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take this bracket and use this to mark where we're going to drill the new holes. If you look right here, you'll see that there are two holes where the bracket used to bolt on. And of course the bracket used to bolt on like this through these two holes. Now the bracket is going to go like this so that this portion of it has been moved backward approximately 16 millimeters. But the evaporative emissions canister would hit the exhaust housing if we just bolted it back into stock holes. So we're going to need to drill two holes approximately 1/4 of an inch below the original two holes. The easiest way to do that is we'll hold it out here and line up with where the original holes are. And if we move it down toward the top of this bracket right here, lines up right dead in the center of the original top hole, and then we will mark the plan where we're going to drill the new holes. And we're just going to use a punch to mark them with. Okay? And now we're going to take a 1/4 inch drill bit and drill the holes right where they're marked. So now you can see what we did was we drilled new holes right below the original two holes. So now we're going to take our bracket from the evaporative emissions canister. I'm going to put this lock plate on, and then we're going to bolt this bracket to where the flange goes forward instead of backward. These two bolts are shorter than the rest of the cabinet bolts, and they must be the shorter ones. If you were to use too long of bolts in this location, it would poke all the way into the evaporative emissions canister and fracture it. So now we will tighten down these two mount bolts. We'll set our evaporative emissions canister back in there, and when you get ready to bolt it on, remember that you're going to be using the bottom hole in each location as opposed to the top one. So now you can see that the original holes have nothing in them, and the two new holes that you drilled into are holding the evaporative emissions canister in place. And now there is room for this spout on the evaporative emissions canister to clear the exhaust housing. The next step will be to take the new fuel pump mounting bracket and the 6mm bolt. This is a 6mm by 1 metric bolt because this generator is all metric threads. This is the mounting bracket that's going to hold the new fuel pump. If you slide it in from here, this hole is where you'll put the 6mm bolt through and thread it into this location on the frame. Where this is bent right here, it folds up and rests against the frame. And that's going to be something that, based on the fact that these are castings that you're bolting it onto, and that the threads are machined into it, there may be certain production tolerances. So we'll test fit the fuel pump bracket and make sure that it's correct, and you'll adjust the bracket for your particular generator when you're done. So what we'll do is go ahead and tighten down this bolt, and then if you come around front and you squat down and sight it, this bracket should be pretty level. If it's up by just a slight bit or down by just a slight bit, that's okay. But you want it as level as you can get it. If it is angled up too much, then you pull the bracket off and straighten out that bend back there, and that would allow it to drop down. If it's dropped down too much, then you pull the bracket off and tighten up that bend with a vise and a ball peen hammer. But our bracket is correct because I've already tweaked it before we shot the video. So the next step is you'll take the fuel pump that's included in the kit, and then there are 2 hose barbs. This fuel pump, incidentally, is a proprietary fuel pump. It's made for me by Facet. The fuel output pressure is 1 to 1.5 pounds fuel pressure. It is not the standard automotive pump with the 6 to 10 pounds pressure. If you use that, it'll override the needle and seat, and you'll have gasoline leaking all over the place. So whatever you do, do not substitute the pump that came in the kit for something else. What you'll do is take the fuel pump, and you'll notice that there's an arrow right down here to show fuel flow direction. So that would be from the longer end to the shorter end. So on the input side, which is the long end, you're going to use the straight hose barb. And you'll take and wrap some Teflon tape around it. And when you're wrapping the Teflon tape, be sure not to overlap the ends of the threads. And by that I mean do not go like that, because when you screw it on, it will shear off that Teflon tape, and that will now become lodged in the fuel pump. Okay, then we'll take the 90-degree hose barb and we'll do the same thing with that. We'll wrap the Teflon tape around the threads without overlapping the end. Now on this one, because this is a 90-degree, it is important as to how it's clocked. This one's straight, so it's always sticking straight down. It's going to be mounted in the generator like this, and we want the hose barb to point out right toward this bolt. So we're going to rotate it around. Like so. When viewed from the top or from the end, you can see that this comes out right to the bolt. And then, included in the kit are two 1/4-inch bolts, 20 threads per inch. The metric bolt will not have a washer and a nut on them. That's how you know which one is the metric bolt and goes into the housing. And these two are the American thread bolts and go into the fuel pump. So ultimately, what you're going to do is you're going to drop the fuel pump behind this bracket and it'll bolt in right here. So I'm going to put this bolt on first and then do this one. Trust me, it is easier to do it this way. I'm going to put the bolts through from the front so that the nut and the washer are in the back, which gives us just a little bit more clearance for the sound deadening material in the cover. And that's why we moved the evaporative emissions canister so that we can mount the fuel pump further back and it will clear the sound deadening in the cover without tearing it up, because we want to leave that in place. This bolt here I'm not going to tighten up yet because we're going to be putting our ground for our wiring harness on this bolt. So what I'm going to do, just to get it to line up, is I'm going to put this bolt through and I'm going to put the nut on the back side of it. You'll notice that I left the washer off for now because it's just a lot easier since I'm not going to be tightening it all the way down. We're going to be pulling the bolt out anyway. We'll put the washer on when we get ready to torque it down. This bolt, however, is going to be torqued down. This one here should be loose. Very good. Okay. Now we're going to pull this cover off. Pull this cover off. This is the same as the other side. We're going to pull the hubcap off and then take out the 10mm headed bolt that holds the wheel on. And again, this wheel is held on with a very short bolt and a flat washer. This is one of the two bolts that I stated earlier should be longer than the other bolts. There are 8 bolts that hold each side cabinet on, and these 2 in this position are longer than the other 6. If you'll look at it, you'll notice that all 8 holes have a steel insert in them. However, this hole and this hole, the bolt goes through an additional piece of plastic that holds the electronics in place. And the other ones, right here, 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 and here, do not. So that's why this position and this position have a much longer bolt. So we're going to pull the cover off the control box. The first step is to take the fuel selector knob off and make sure that the fuel selector knob is in the off position, otherwise you'll have gasoline running out onto the ground when you do it, or when you get ready to take the next step. So you'll put the fuel selector knob in the off position or store position. Take the Phillips head screw, right here, loosen it. Don't lose that screw. Set them off the side. Then there are 4 more Phillips head screws that hold just the cover onto the control panel, and we'll take them off next. The control box and the control box cover will still be held on with this bolt, and we'll take those off last. As you can see, the control panel is dropping away from the housing right now. The kit is going to include a section of 3/16 hose and a section of 1/4" hose, and I'll be specific about it as to which hose we're using as I explain the assembly of the kit. I will explain as I'm assembling the kit which hose you're using, whether it's the 3/16 or the 1/4". The first step is going to be to take the 3/16 hose and cut a section of that 10 1/4 inches long. Do your level best to be very exact on the measurements that I'm giving you. So the 3/16 hose will be 10 1/4 inches long. You'll have an extra bit that you can discard. The kit will come with an adapter to go from 1/4 to 3/16. So you'll take the adapter and put the 3/16 inch into the 3/16 hose. Like so. Then you'll cut a section of the 1/4 inch hose 7 3/4 of an inch long. and put that onto the 1/4 inch side of the adapter. Then your kit will have a fuel filter, and the fuel filter will have arrows that show the direction of fuel flow, and obviously it'll go in from the pump and out to the carburetor. So the next step you're going to do is to install the fuel filter into the 1/4 inch section of hose, like so. Then you're going to take a section of the 1/4 inch hose and cut it to exactly 5 inches long. And that will go onto the fuel filter. Like so. The fuel filter, or this section of 5-inch hose, is going to be put onto the output of the fuel pump, and that would be the 90-degree output. So we'll set that aside for later. Then you're going to have a 1/4 inch fuel T. So you'll take the 1/4 inch hose and you'll cut an 8 1/4 inch section of the 1/4 inch fuel hose. You'll put that onto one of the sides of the T-fitting. Like so. Then you'll take and cut a 24.5 inch section of the 1/4 inch hose. And put it onto the side leg of the T-fitting. Okay. So then you'll take the remainder of the 1/4 inch hose. You're not going to cut this yet. You're going to trim it to fit once you get it installed in the generator. And you'll install one end of the hose onto the center leg of the T-fitting. Okay, so we've got these set aside. What we're going to do now is we're going to remove the stock fuel hose, and that goes from the fuel selector valve to the carburetor. I'm going to go ahead and remove the airbox because it makes it a lot easier. There are 2 clamps that hold the lid on the airbox. And drops out through that side. You could fight it out through this side if you wanted to. The airbox itself is held on with 2 10mm nuts. One is right here, and the other is on the end of this bolt here. A little difficult to see. There's one. There's the other. And then we'll go ahead and slide the airbox itself back just a little bit. And we'll take the breather hose off the top. That'll be this large hose with a bend to it. Then we're going to loosen the bottom hose clamp right here. And it's just a worm drive hose clamp. Then if you come around, take this, and we'll pull the airbox out completely. There are two metal inserts right here that keep the airbox from being crushed by the nuts. Just make sure you don't lose those inserts. So now you can see this hose right here is the one that goes from the fuel selector valve to the carburetor. And you'll remove both ends of this hose and set it to the side. The hose ends are held on with a Corbin clamp, and when I get it out, I'll show you what a Corbin clamp is and how it works. But the first one, I just wiggle loose from the bottom and slide that hose clamp or hose off of the barb. Then this one here, need a slightly shorter pair of pliers. So here is the hose that you're taking out. To operate a Corbin clamp, there's two tabs, and you simply squeeze them together. When you squeeze them together, you notice that the clamp gets larger. When you release them into place, it tightens down around the hose. So to get these clamps off, you would squeeze the two tabs and just wiggle it off. You're going to be setting this entire hose off the side. You will not be reusing it. Okay, this is the hose that I have removed from the Okay, now this is the hose that I just removed that went from the fuel selector valve to the carburetor. You notice one end of the hose is 1/4 inch, the other end of the hose is 3/16 inch. So that's why in my kit we will have a section of 3/16 hose and a section of 1/4 inch hose. It is not that one side is not going to fit tight or anything. It's that the original hose that we removed was a formed hose, and this side here, as you can see, is expanded to 1/4 inch diameter. At any rate, we'll go ahead and set this one aside, and again, this is the hose that went from the fuel selector valve to the carburetor. Okay, included in the kit are a bunch of hose clamps, and there are two different size hose clamps, and those will be for the 1/4 inch hose and for the 3/16 hose. So on the section of 3/16 hose where it goes onto the adapter, put a 3/16 coupler and squeeze it down tight. Incidentally, if they aren't lined up right, you can squeeze side to side and align them. And if you need to undo the clamp, you would grab one side and twist sideways, and it'll open up. So the clamps can be opened. So we'll go ahead and put this back on and squeeze it down. Then on this side, we'll have 1/4 inch hose clamps, and they work exactly the same way, just a little larger. And like I say, if they line up like that, you'd squeeze side to side, straighten them out. Then on this one, we're going to do the same thing. This is going to be all 1/4 inch hose clamps, and we're going to put them in all the necessary places. Keeping in mind that on this fitting here, it's pretty tight where the T goes. So on the two sides of the T, I'm going to point the clasp portion of the hose clamp up, and you'll see why later when we go to install it. And then the third leg of the T, I'm going to put to the back, so it'll go toward the airbox. And actually on this one, it could go forward or backward. It just cannot go straight to the side because the sides are taken up with the sections that go to either side. Okay. So now this is ready to be installed on the generator as a unit. The short section right here is going to go to the fuel pump inlet side, and that'll be the bottom straight arrow, or straight fitting. And that goes on just like that. If you look, you can see where this T-fitting sits down in here, and now you understand why I said to put the clamps the way I did. The side that goes off to the right, you'll put it under the airbox, and you'll notice that there are two hoses coming out of the carburetor. One is the float bowl drain, the other is the float bowl vent. There are two areas in the bottom tray molding for those hoses to go into. If they come out when you're putting this hose in, you just put them back in place. And of course, when you're finished with the kit, you want to make sure that they're in that location. Then if you come around to this side of the generator, this is the section of 1/4 inch hose that went off to the right earlier. That's going to come up and around in a loop and go on to the back of the fuel selector valve. This is the fuel selector valve right here, and there's a barb on the back of it, which is what we just took the original stock hose off of. Okay, that's slid all the way on now. And what we'll do is we'll put a 1/4 inch hose clamp on that and squeeze it down. I'm going to start the hose clamp right here and just give it a couple of clicks and then slide it up into place. got that in place. Okay, this hose here, we're just going to leave hanging loose because we're going to trim that to fit later on. We're going to take another hose clamp. We're going to crimp it on to the input side of the fuel pump. And that's a whole lot easier to get the clamp onto. Then this hose clamp, or this hose that we assembled earlier, is going to go onto the output side of the fuel pump. So we're going to take the section with the 3/16 hose and we're going to feed it right over the top of the airbox, and it'll come out through that side. The area with the fuel filter should go in this recessed area here, and that's why we had this section of hose trimmed to a 5-inch long section of hose. And now we're going to take this hose and slide it on to this 90-degree bracket here. We're going to go ahead and put 1/4-inch clamp right here. Then this 3/16 side will come up and curve around and go onto the inlet of the carburetor. I don't know if you can see it through there or not. Okay. Okay. And then we'll take a section of 3/16 or a 3/16 hose clamp and put it on that. And that has our basic hose routing done. So now we're going to go to the electrical portion of it. The kit's going to come with this wiring harness. And if you think about it for a minute, you want the fuel pump to be able to run only when the generator is running, never when the generator is just sitting there, because you don't want a pump transferring fuel into a generator that's not running. Number two, you want it to only run when the switch is in the gasoline position, as opposed to any time the generator is running. And number three, you want the fuel system to shut down at any point that the generator stalls for any reason. So if you come around here, you'll notice that this first device, the voltage regulator, has a 4-wire harness coming out of it. On this side of the harness, there are 2 wires that are just brown. Take either one of those, doesn't matter which one you use. And in the kit, there's a posi tap. I'll show you how the posi taps work. Think of it as a reusable Scotch clip or Scotch splice. You'll hook this, excuse me. They look like this originally. So you'll unscrew the big end from the base, and you'll slide that around the wire. You notice the other end has a wire piercing probe. You'll screw that down where it pierces the wire. Then the small end will also unscrew, like so. So on the kit, there's a short brown wire. You'll slide this over the short brown wire and then strip about 8 millimeters of insulation off of the brown wire. Like so. Then you will slide the stripped insulation portion down next to the threaded conductor, and then slide this threaded coupling onto it and screw it into place tight. And you tug on it, you notice that's on there solidly now. So that's under control. Then on the main switch, down here there's a red wire and a white wire. The white wire is in the center position. On the bottom of the switch is the red wire. And we want to hook into the bottom one, because if we hooked into the top one, then it would be powered all the time. And we want this to only be powered when the ignition switch, or be possible to be powered when the ignition switch is in the on position. So you'll see that there's a piggyback connector on my harness. You hook the red wire onto the piggyback, like so. And then you'll slide the piggyback onto the bottom connector on the switch, like so. Then, ultimately, these relays are going to lay right here, one at either side of the main start switch. There's a black ground wire, and if you look down here, you'll see that there's a ground wire on the stud on the bottom of the housing, and that's got a 7 millimeter nut. So we'll take that 7 millimeter nut off, and we'll slide the ground wire from the kit over it, and then put the nut back on. Flashlight so I can see it. Okay. When you put our ground wire onto that stud, be very careful not to accidentally knock their wires off of it. So when you're done, there should be 3 wires on that stud. And once I get this nut started, I'll pull my hands out so you can see it again. Okay. So you can see there's the 2 factory wires. I believe they're brown with a yellow tracer. And then there's my wire, which is black. Okay. Make sure that all looks nice. Then finally, there are 2 red wires with quarter spade connectors. Now you'll notice on the fuel choice switch, there are 2 open tabs. Put one of my red wires on the lower tab, the other one onto the upper tab. And it does not matter which goes to which position. That's why I made them both red, so that nobody would stress out wondering which wire goes in which location. Then you'll see right here is the propane hose, and it has a hole drilled into the housing. You'll take this harness with the yellow wire and the black wire and feed it down next to the propane hose. We'll reach up and grab it from below, and we'll pull that on down. So now that harness is hanging down from the bottom of the control panel. Now we will put the control panel back together very carefully without pinching any wires. Wow, that actually went pretty nice. The sound deadening material goes behind this metal flange. So I'm going to start by putting in the top 2 bolts, which go through the steel cover panel and the plastic. And we're just going to leave it hanging like that, so it's not hanging from the wiring harness. Now, we'll come back around here and make sure that the gasket for the carburetor is in the right position, and it is. And then, included in the kit is a whole bunch of zip ties. On the blower housing, there's an area right here that I don't want the fuel hose that goes from the from the stock tank to our pump kit getting rubbed against that. So I'm going to zip tie the hose and the wiring harness right here in place so that it doesn't vibrate around. It's held securely in place. Right here. And then we'll go ahead and trim that zip tie in. I want to just stick my hand up there and feel around and make sure that no wires are kinked. Then we'll take another zip tie and a 3/16 hose that goes to the carburetor inlet. I'm going to make sure that that's not pinched against anything. And we're going to go ahead and put it held in place by a zip tie also. And it doesn't have to be super tight or anything like that. We're just keeping it from vibrating around. And I'll cut the tail off of that. So now our fuel filter is right here visible, so that if we pull the maintenance cover off to check the air filter or spark plug or anything else, we can also check the fuel filter. Okay, we're going to take this harness, we're going to run it along next to the 1/4-inch hose. It goes to the inlet side of the fuel pump. And the red bullet connector will plug into the yellow wire, like so. And then the black wire will join this black wire, and that's why we left this bolt loose. We're now going to go ahead and put those two onto this bolt and tighten it down. Now, if you remember, the fuel pump is plastic instead of metal. So we'll put the washer on the back side where the plastic fuel pump is before we put a nut in that. We'll put our washer in place. And we'll put our nut up there in place. We hope to do it without dropping it. So now we have all our wires connected to the fuel pump. We can tuck these out of place, or out of the way. Then we come back to our control panel side, make sure that everything is lined up so we can put our 4 Phillips head screws into place on that cover. I'm not tightening the screws all the way down yet, because I want to make sure everything lines up before we get too crazy with this. Okay. Once you get all the screws in, you can go ahead and tighten them down. I'm going to temporarily put my 2 long screws in here so that they'll hold everything in alignment before I tighten down the 2 top ones. Before we put this cover panel on, we're going to put the airbox back in place. So I'm going to slide it in. The first thing I'm doing is getting that hose down onto the bottom section of the airbox right here, where the clamp is. And then we'll make sure that our gasket isn't pinched, and then slide the airbox over those 2 studs. Once we get the airbox over the 2 studs, we'll loosely put the nuts onto the studs. Incidentally, if I didn't mention it earlier, the nuts are a 10 millimeter. down our hose clamp. Make sure our hose clamp is, oops, big mistake there. Okay. Now the hose clamp is in the groove where it's supposed to be. Make sure and double check that. You don't want the hose clamp walking out of the groove. Okay. All that looks good. Okay. Now we put the lid on the airbox. You notice that there's two slots. So you'll stick this in and then hook it over the tabs and pull back on it and then put it into place. Like so. And then we'll snap the clips back on. Next thing is to put the crankcase vent line back onto the barb on the top of the airbox. And make sure that it's not kinked, and it's not. Very good. Okay. Then you'll come over to this side here, and the two bottom bolts we left loose. You'll go ahead and take them all the way out now, because they were just put in there loose in order to maintain everything's alignment. And remember that these two bolts are the two long ones in the cabinet. We'll go ahead and make sure that these are snug and that the pulse head screws are snug. Okay. Then we'll get our cabinet cover to put on. First two bolts I'm going to put in are the two really long ones. Then I'll take 6 of the shorter ones. we'll go ahead and put the fuel selector valve in place. Or excuse me, the knob for the fuel selector valve in place. And remember that we took it apart with it in the storage position, so it'll go back together with the knob in the storage position. Take the wheel, put that back on. We put the hubcap in place. We'll go back to this side, take the cover, set it on, and grab a couple of the bolts. We're going to get all the bolts started before we go tightening them down. Now the next step is going to be to install the fuel inlet port. And the fuel inlet port consists of a quick disconnect fitting, and this is the Yamaha style quick disconnect that I use on all my kits, and a hose barb that screws onto the back side of it. You will put the Teflon tape on this and tighten the quick disconnect or the hose barb on from the back side, and that creates a pinch fit around the panel wherever you put it in. You can put this fitting anywhere you want, provided that there's enough room behind it to get the fuel line in. I prefer to put it on the front of the generator here, so that when the handlebars fold down, it clears this bar. You won't scrape your feet on it, and there's enough room behind the panel between the exhaust housing and the fuel tank. There's plenty of room behind it that you won't have trouble installing it. So what we'll do is get ready to do the install here. Okay. And the final step will be this hose here is going to run up, and that'll be the fuel inlet port from our remote fuel kit. And just make sure that it's not getting in the way of anything. Probably easier, or excuse me, better to run it behind the crankcase breather line. Now, if you measure, and let me get a tape measure, I'll show you. Directly over from this body line this way 7 inches, which on this one lines up with the center of the bottom of this leg of the letter M. And since I don't know if all the decals are stuck on in the exact same spot, I'll say to measure it just for the heck of it. That way you know you're dead right. But if you feel behind here, there's some plastic webbing, and one of the webs runs right along through here. So if you drill your hole just slightly below the center of this line, or even with this line here, will be okay. What you're going to do is, this is going to be the quick disconnect fitting that sticks out the front of the generator. This is going to be the hose barb that goes onto the back. So you're going to put flat washer on the front, and that spreads the load over a little bit larger area. And then put the hose barb on the back and tighten it down, and it'll create a pinch point between the housing and the between the hose barb and the quick disconnect fitting. I'm going to go ahead and drill a small pilot hole to see if I can bias the hole up as high as I can. So the higher that is, the better it'll clear this cross member, and you'll see why in a little bit. So I'm going to drill my hole right in the top portion of that. Okay. That's absolutely as high as I can go without causing problems. So when I go with the step drill, I'm going to bias it down just a little bit. And you want to make sure not to drill the hole too large. You want it just big enough for the fitting to go through. Okay, really snug fit right there. That actually is a perfect fit. If it were not a perfect fit, what I would do is clamp the edge of the washer in a vise and bend it over just a little bit so that the washer would follow the contour of the cabinet. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take the Teflon tape and wrap it around the threads. We're going to do the same thing that we did earlier with the other hose barbs. I'm going to put Teflon tape around the threads, making certain not to overlap the edge like that. We want to keep it on the thread and not overlap the front, because if we did, that would allow a piece of Teflon tape to get sliced off. So we're going to put the fitting through, and we're going to face it off to the side. If we faced it straight down, it would come into conflict with this cross member. What I'm doing is just tearing out just a little bit of the foam around the hole that we drilled so that we won't run into a problem with that. I'll tear off this Teflon tape I had sitting in there. And now your fitting points to the side so that when you fold down this handle, it clears. And you can see that that would be a problem if you pointed them down. So then you'll reach in here and make sure that the hose is in a nice smooth radiused bend. And I'm going to cut the hose at this location. Just a little bit more hose than I needed. And that's why I leave this hose untrimmed until the very last bit. Okay. And now I'll put a hose clamp onto the back of this, tighten it down. The question that I get asked a lot is, can I use my stock tank with your kit installed? Yes, you can. Make sure that these hoses here are in the correct slots, and they are. No hoses pinched. And we'll go ahead and put this cover back on. You'll notice, because we relocated the evaporative emissions canister back farther, we're able to mount the fuel pump back farther so that it doesn't have to cut away the insulation foam or the sound deadening foam. Now we have the wheel for this side. And then we have a sticker that's the operating instructions. And when you get the kit, you can read through it. It'll make perfect sense. I do want to point this out. Step 7 is not a misprint. And that's where it states to run it with the fuel selector valve in the off position when you're running it off the remote tank. And that is not a misprint. Move the fuel selector valve to the off position when you're running it off the remote tank. And I stick the sticker to the top of the fuel tank itself. Let me go ahead and lower the cart. And it doesn't matter where exactly you put the sticker, as long as it's visible. Actually, thinking about it, if somebody's putting fuel in it, they're going to be standing beside the generator to one side or the other. So I'm going to put it here to where it's right side up when somebody's standing at this side of the generator. Okay, so now when you want to run it off the remote tank, you can either hook it to the remote tank or you can put it to the stock tank. In a stock tank, or when you're running off the stock tank, you want the fuel selector valve to be in the on position, which would be like that. In the off position for the remote tank, and it's set up to where the fuel pump will not run if you've got it in the LP position or if the generator is not actually running. Even though the master switch is in the on position, it will not turn on the fuel pump until the engine is actually running. And that way it doesn't try to override the needle and seat. And as I stated earlier, this is a special proprietary pump with 1 to 1.5 pounds fuel pressure, so it does not override the needle and seat. If you have any questions whatsoever, look in the description section of this website, of this video, if you're looking at it on YouTube. And it has a link to get to my website. If you need to get in touch with me for any questions whatsoever, do not attempt to contact me through YouTube. I do not monitor YouTube. I just don't have time to monitor chat rooms and YouTube and things like that. But if you go to my website, you can get a hold of me by email and get a very quick response. At any rate, I thank you for your time.